You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa Tang. I'm going to start this episode by throwing out some keywords, and I want you to think about who in society I might be talking about. Vital, indispensable, necessity. Well, those are some ways the International Labour Organization describes migrant workers.
Millions of people every year cross national borders in search of better work opportunities. Now, these migrants play a crucial role in the economic fabric of both their host and their home countries.
From filling labor shortages to sending money home to their families, these men and women are a critical part of the global economy. But the path they take isn't an easy one. CNA's digital team recently produced a special series called Far From Home. It focused on migrant workers here in Southeast Asia and explored what drives people to seek work outside their native countries. It was led by Senior Correspondent Nivell Rayda, and he joins me today. Hi, Nivell. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Teresa. Always a pleasure.
Migrants, the migrant story, it's one we've come across before in headlines. And, some of us see these people in daily life as well. But there is something about these workers in Southeast Asia that inspired you to look a little bit closer. Can you tell me what piqued your interest?
Well, the issue of migrant worker has always intrigued me, particularly since I live in Indonesia, a major migrant worker sending country. But even in Indonesia, you rarely hear about the 4.8 million Indonesians working abroad. They never made the news unless they're accused of crime, face the death penalty, being abused or killed. But they have very interesting stories to tell. Stories about how they only get to see their kids for a few weeks every 1 or 2 years. Stories of how overwhelming it is for someone who never traveled more than a few kilometers from their village, and suddenly they have to live in a foreign country with a culture and language that are vastly different from their own. So there are endless amount of stories just waiting to be told. And now initially I wanted to focus on migrant workers from Indonesia, but my editors convinced me to broaden the scope a little bit to the whole of Southeast Asia. And we realized early on that the issue is so complex and multifaceted, it needs to be a series, starting from where they come from, where they are headed, why some chose to go there illegally, and all the way to what happened when they return and have to reintegrate back to their original society. And because I live in a sending country in Indonesia, we need a second correspondent for the project, which is my colleague who lives in KL, Rashfinjit Bedi, to get the perspective of the receiving country. Now, Rashfin is supposed to be here today, but he's on a paternity leave because he just had twins.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a good excuse. Okay. Southeast Asia, where we are, it's an interesting region when it comes to this issue because it's part of the world that both sends and also receives migrants, right? So let's talk about the push factors. What are some of the main reasons people leave their homes and their families behind?
Well, we interviewed migrant workers in Indonesia and the Philippines. What I can say is that their story is universal. You want what is best for your family. And unfortunately for many in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, jobs are hard to come by, especially if you live away from the big cities, especially if you only have like a junior high school diploma to your name. The only way to get decent paying jobs is to go overseas. Now, there's this one woman I met in the Philippines. Her name is Gina Fabiano, and she lives right next to a landfill. The only work available is to be trash pickers. She has 5 kids, and she's the second oldest of 14 siblings. So
Wow.
she's kind of the backbone of not only her immediate family, but also for her brothers and sisters. And she kind of like epitomizes the whole series, I think. But it's hard, she was making many times more as a domestic helper in Saudi Arabia than she would as a trash picker back home. But her decision also come at a personal, emotional cost for her. And here's my interview with Gina.
The most difficult part was I was not able to take care of my only daughter. All I could do was call her on the phone and ask, "What are you doing now? Did you eat? Are you going to school?" But the girl I took care of in Saudi Arabia, I could tie her hair, feed her properly, tuck her into bed. I was able to take care of her, but I couldn't even care for my own kids.
So clearly there is the financial payoff for working overseas as a migrant worker. Like you say, you can support your family in a way that would otherwise really be impossible. But then the cost of that opportunity can be immense, right? Families essentially torn apart when a parent has to leave for work.
Yeah, migration is always tough, For parents, they miss the chance to watch their children grow up or share important moments like birthdays, Christmas, or even first day of school, graduation, all sorts of things. And there's just this one woman from Indonesia who, after many years, she is still struggling to get close to her daughter, who she left when the daughter was still a toddler. There are also families who fell apart because of the migration. The migrant workers met someone else overseas, or perhaps the spouse back home, they met someone else, and the temptation gets stronger as years go by. Migration kind of reshapes who you are as a person. You feel less and less connected with your family back home and more with your fellow migrant workers abroad. And Anis Hidayah, who is a commissioner at the Indonesian Commission for Human Rights, she is a longtime migrant workers' rights advocate. She has seen it all. And here's my interview with her.
Aside from the risk of human rights violations, there are also social costs they have to pay for their decision to go overseas as migrant workers. Their children are at risk of having problems in their social lives. On the other hand, there are problems like the disintegration of families.
And the same thing is happening in the Philippines. There is a huge personal, emotional, and social cost that comes with migration. And it's not only the migrant workers who are paying the price. Their children also have to navigate the consequence of not having one or sometimes both parents around. For some children, they are forced to grow up, become the man of the house, and take on the responsibility of, doing the chores. But there are also children who struggle with the separation. And I spoke to Marvin Rimas of Migrante Philippines. He said without the guidance and structure of a normal household, some children end up misbehaving, skipping schools, dropping out, running away, and in extreme cases, commit crimes. Here's my interview with Marvin Rimas.
Their children, they don't have the parental guidance, especially from the mother. So their mother is working abroad, their daughter, their children's experiencing the separation, anxiety, and anxiety, depressions came in to them. Then they're looking for something that they can release or can loosen their depression. So most of them are having drugs use, violence, sexual exploitation, or sexual abuse.
One part of the story, of course, is money, and a lot of money is involved here. Remittances to the Philippines, for example, those amount to about $40 billion a year. That's 9.2% of the country's GDP. That's incredible. And another angle that you looked at, Nivell, are emerging markets, new markets that are attracting migrant workers. Tell me why this change, and are conditions, better in these quote-unquote new countries?
Well, since the 1970s, Gulf states like UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar have been the go-to countries for migrant workers from Southeast Asia. There's a huge demand for laborers, construction workers, and domestic helpers there. And because they are oil-rich countries, they are willing to pay top dollars. But after a series of abuse cases, some of which ended with migrant workers being brutally killed, more and more people are becoming reluctant of going to the Middle East. At the same time, you have countries in East Asia with aging population and declining birth rates. Before, these countries didn't feel it was necessary to bring in migrant workers. But now, with the aging population, with declining birth rates, there is a growing demand for caregivers, for example. And they also try to make it easier for couples to hire migrant workers as nannies so they can have children without sacrificing their career. But those opportunities in East Asia is still very limited. There is a strict quota imposed by countries like South Korea or territories like Taiwan, and everyone from Indonesia and the Philippines is basically competing to make the cut, basically. So you have to be very skillful, have long experience in other countries if you want to work in these countries and territories. Middle Eastern countries don't have such requirements and quotas in place. So there are still migrant workers going there because they only have a junior high school diploma, for example, which is why, although the numbers are declining, they are still the top destination countries for migrant workers, especially inexperienced and low-skilled migrants. And also after some pressure from Indonesia and the Philippines and other sending countries, these Gulf states promised that they will change their way to provide better protection for migrant workers. But is it enough to turn the tide? We'll just have to see.
I know you have a baby at home. I have 2 young children as well, and I'm raising them here in Singapore. And migrant workers are people we come across every single day. My daughter, now she'll say hi to them. And for Christmas, we donate to a charity that actually provides some supplies to them over the holidays. And, there's a level of respect and this gratitude that comes naturally to my kids now. But that's not the case for many people. And we know migrants are often looked down upon. And I know from your reporting, you found that some migrants are trying to change that perception. They're seeking to be active in their adopted communities, which I find very interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Actually, it was our KL correspondent Rashfin who was helming that part of the series. But you're right. They are often looked down upon. They have endured discrimination and racism from the second they arrive in their host country. Sometimes, which is why Rashfin and I agreed that it was very easy for us to speak to migrant workers who have returned home, like when they came back to Indonesia or when they come back to the Philippines, compared to those who are still abroad. Because they're here in Indonesia or the Philippines, they're free to speak their minds openly. But once they're in their host country, they're very reluctant to speak, fearing what they say, or even the fact that they're talking to a journalist might cost them their job or their visa, Which is why they tend to form communities, because of the discrimination and everything that they have endured. They tend to form communities within themselves so they can basically interact and support each other. And over time, these communities and these groups started doing charity works, and not only for members of their own community, which is how they started, but to those less fortunate they see around them, regardless of race, religion, immigration status, or where they come from. That is truly amazing because here's a group of migrant workers getting together on what little free time that they have, giving back to the community, doing charitable works, even though they don't make a lot, even though they come from a country where poverty is even more rampant, And Rashfin talked to one of them, Jackalu Cabello. They're not doing this for publicity or to advocate for some greater cause, like to change perception or fight stigma towards migrant workers. They just want to do it out of the goodness of their own heart. And that's really touching for me. Here's Rashfin's interview with Jackalu.
Yeah, I feel empowered and I feel so blessed because I am not on their situation. Their situation makes me more motivation to work harder so I can give myself and my family a better future. It's like off day. We like to help people, like homeless. We like to share our blessings.
It really is so inspiring that people with so little are still willing to give. Yeah. I've never employed a domestic helper. I don't know if you have, but I know people who have. And the day that their helpers leave is really a sad one because they've become part of the family after so many years. So you talk about migrant workers who go back to their native countries, who might go back to Indonesia. What's the most difficult part about that reintegration? And are governments doing anything to give them that support that they need?
Actually, this is something that I've never realized until I'm doing the series, that for people who, especially people who have been away for a long time, fitting back into their original community can be just as hard as when they first migrated to another country. in a foreign country, they're used to being active and busy doing their work, and they're used to live in a big crowded city, and suddenly they have to go back to their quiet remote village with very little thing to do. And especially if you've been away for a long time, things are not always the same as when you left them. People age, people change. The migrant workers themselves, they have changed. They have picked up an accent, for example. They still use terms and words that nobody has used in decades. And they got teased a lot. And back home, no one understands what they have been through. They work almost round the clock with very little time for themselves. Sometimes because they need to send money home, they starve themselves or have to live in a very poor condition. And when they get back home, the house is basically still the same dilapidated wooden house that they live in when she left. And but your husband is wearing gold necklace now. Your kids have new phones, So it can be mentally exhausting for them seeing this. And the only way to escape all this is to find work, to keep yourself busy. But there's no work available. Which brings me to the next issue, which is financial literacy. Financial literacy is important because for many of these people, they have never seen this kind of money before. And the instinct that they have is to spend whatever is coming their way, like there's no tomorrow. So they spend it on things, on vacations, on cars, on all these things. Because they don't know how to manage their money, it is very common for migrant workers to come back and fall back into poverty once they return back to their countries. But the government of Indonesia and the Philippines are starting to do something about this. They have come up with grants, soft loans, training, so they can start their own businesses. But of course, their experts are criticizing this because they give so little to so few beneficiaries. And not everyone is fit to be an entrepreneur, Some have tried and failed. For some, it's just easier for them to just look for jobs, But that is also not available. And as a result, you have people re-migrating to other countries. And experts say the best way is for the government to provide more jobs, provide reskilling programs. So migration becomes a choice for them and not a necessity.
So many dimensions to this story. Nivell, what an insightful and humanizing series. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Welcome.
And Rashvin, we missed you. Now, Nivell and Rashvin worked on a special series on migrant workers from Southeast Asia, and you can find all of their reports on CNA.Asia. There are also TV episodes of CNA Correspondent every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, and you can find those on YouTube as well. I'm Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining me this week. The team behind this week's episode is Faiz, Clara Ong, Tiffany Ung, Junaini Johari, and Craig Dale. Bye for now.